Well, took me long enough to make this video. For those who are unaware, His Infernal Majesty, aka Him, was a Finnish rock band that was active between the years of 1991 to 1993. They disbanded and then reformed and stayed active between the years of 1995 to 2017. Before I get into the heartograms, their commercial success, and their distinct sound that would appeal to millions of fans around the world during the turn of the millennia, we have to dial it back to their humble beginnings in 1991. Originally, Him was formed by childhood friends Ville Valo and Mikko Mij Paananen. During this time, Ville Valo was only 14 or 15 years old, and Mij was only 16 or 17 years old. They were only teenagers, and they were able to release a 4-track demo called Witches and Other Night Fears. The lineup for this release is completely different from what we know Him as today. For starters, Ville Valo does do vocals on here, but he also played a 6-string bass, which would substitute for a guitar. They didn't have a guitarist for this release. Mij would then just play regular bass, and at this point or time period they had 2 drummers, one of which would play in the studio for recording, and since he had stage fright, they would get a second drummer to play the material live. While you're able to hear the material on this demo online, like YouTube for example, it would never end up seeing the light of day in terms of a physical release, mainly because Ville Valo always thought that the performance, music, and overall production value on this really doesn't live up to his standards. And while I understand that it's a demo, they're starting from the ground up and they didn't really have like the financial resources to release something of high quality, it still would have been cool to have this be released physically for, like, you know, the diehard fans out there that like to collect music. And while I get the fact that yes, it's a demo, it's not going to compete with the full lengths that I'll be talking about later on, and it kind of plays into the whole idea that he is his own harshest critic, which is what Ville Valo is kind of like looking at this demo. For what it's worth, there are some pretty catchy melodies on here, and even considering the fact that Ville Valo is playing the guitar with the 6-string bass, it still jams out quite hard. And I feel like for people who are looking for this, you know, hybrid blend of like goth rock and punk rock, can find a bit of enjoyment with this demo. Shortly after writing the material for this demo, they would end up doing local shows around Finland, but ultimately the first incarnation of Him was cut short in 1993 when Mij, the bass player, had to do military service. 2 years later, in 1995, Him would reform with Ville Valo on vocals, along with doing some percussion work, a new member named Mikko Linda Lindstrom, who would be the guitarist for Him from that point onwards until they would end in 2017, along with the returning member of Ming coming back from his military service, once again picking up the bass for Him, being the bassist for Him from that point onwards all the way to the end of Him in 2017 as well. During the first year of this band's reformation in 1995, Him, or at this point they were still considering themselves His Infernal Majesty, were playing local shows around the area of Helsinki, Finland, and most of their live performances consisted of doing cover songs to that of Typo Negative, which is quite significant when you take into factor that Typo Negative is one of the many bands and artists that Him would take influence from as they progressed onwards. It's also worth mentioning during this time of the early 90s and mid 90s, as I refer to this band as Him, as we all do, they call themselves His Infernal Majesty, but they shortened and abbreviated it to Him, mainly having to do with the fact that the native people of Finland, which was their audience at this time, had strong difficulties pronouncing their whole name, His Infernal Majesty. So to make it simpler for their audience in Finland, they shortened it to what we know as it today being Him. A year later, in 1996, Him would release an EP called 666 Ways to Love Prologue. While this EP contains 4 tracks and it clocks in a little under 20 minutes long, there is some standout material that needs to be mentioned here. For starters, the opening track, Stigmata Diaboli, which is one of the many personal favorites of mine in the Hymns discography, I would argue is probably the most punk rock sounding song Hymn has ever wrote, along with the closing track, The Heartless, which would then be featured on their debut full-length album, just shortened a little bit from 7.5 minutes on the EP to 4.5 minutes on the full length. But the standout song that already gave Hymn a bit of recognition in their home country at a really early start would be the cover they did of Chris Isaak's Wicked Game. The original version of Wicked Game, done by Chris Isaak, is a love song that's very somber, moody, and has this like erotic flair to it. Whereas the Hymn cover of Wicked Game is not somber, as it's a lot heavier as one would expect, with this mixture of hard rock and this gothic metal blend that would become a signature sound for them. Yet it still captures the moody and erotic nature of the song as it originally was. It would end up hitting the right notes for the locals in Finland, so much so that it was a highly requested song to be played among the radio stations in Finland, which definitely helped spread the word of Hymn. A year later in 1997, Hymn would end up releasing their debut full-length album, Greatest Love Songs, Volume 666. A significant album in their discography for a multitude of reasons. Not only is this their debut full-length album, but already this early on, they basically patented their sound to a T. It's a mixture of gothic rock, hard rock, and forms of gothic metal that, yes, it takes influences from Typo Negative, as that's usually the band they were mostly compared to during this time, but other influences as well, such as Sisters of Mercy, Fields of the Nephilim, and even Black Sabbath to a certain extent, that I would say out of everything in their discography, this album is easily their darkest and most gothic focused. As for the track listing on this album, it consists of 2 songs from the previous EP that they did, that being The Heartless, which is a song all about Billy Vallo's first ever crush when he was a teenager, to the cover song of Chris Isaak's Wicked Game. As for the rest of the album, it contains fan favorites such as For You, It's All Tears, and my all-time favorite Hymn song, period, Your Sweet 666, that I think has the most infectious chorus and guitar melody they would ever write. It's also worth mentioning towards the end portion of this album, there is a second cover song, that being of Don't Fear the Reaper, originally done by Blue Oyster Cult. What's interesting about the cover done by Hymn is that Billy Vallo always thought that this track should be done in the sense of a duet with a man and a woman, kind of like this vibe of this Romeo and Juliet type of relationship. Thus they would include the vocals of Sanna June Hyde, who was the ex-girlfriend to that of the guitarist for him, Linda Lindstrom. And what you get here with this sound, again, as I stated, is this Romeo and Juliet type of, vibe and atmosphere with the song that makes it all the more moody, gothic, and more, erotic sounding. And I know this is incredibly biased on my behalf because I'm like this diehard Hymn fan, but of all the covers out there that you can hear of Don't Fear the Reaper by Blue Oyster Cult, Hymns has always stood out to me so much in the longevity of things because it really dives quite hard in that gothic aesthetic. Speaking of which, when it comes to the aesthetic, lyrical themes, and overall visuals of Hymn with this particular album, Greatest Love Songs, Volume 666, is yes, it has to do with themes of love, heartbreak, and relationships, which is kind of like, common 101 knowledge of anything to do with Hymn's music, yes, but for the aesthetic and overall presentation, it's way more rooted in like that evil kind of like satanic kind of imagery and themes, mainly because you'll notice with this album, with the album title, the opening track, Your Sweet 666, and the album length being 66 minutes and 6 seconds, even the even the file space that this album takes up for an MP3 download, which would be 666 megabytes, it's so heavily focused with that number. A huge reason for that, believe it or not, is that Billy Vallow always had fascination, and he's quite a fan of, believe it or not, Norwegian black metal, and seeing all of that evil, crazy things that were happening in Norway during around the mid-90s, of the church burnings and all of that jazz, that to him kind of replicated like that punk rock type of attitude of like, you know, screw the establishment and society, we're gonna do our own like crazy things, I guess. He had a strong fondness of that, considering it was just so close to him, as he's from Finland, and that's just only like one country over in the kind of like Nordic region. So again, it's kind of like just his fascination with that, which was a huge reason as to why you see so much of like this satanic themes being present with this album. Again, during this time, I believe Billy Vallow was only, what, I think 20 years old. So him being like this angsty kind of like young adult, again, kind of plays into the themes a little bit here. But the real selling point for him with its aesthetics was just the band themselves. They're young, new, they have that gothic kind of like edgy nature to them that would be very appealing and attractive to a younger audience. So much so that record sales for them were already starting off very strongly, selling over 60,000 copies alone in Finland, going platinum in Finland, and even charting on the German charts. Thus, already this early on, without really any kind of like outsider help or international support, they were already selling quite big in their surrounding area. Him would only end up finding even more success with their follow-up full-length album in the year 2000, that being Razorblade Romance. This album would see him, on the production value sense, be a lot more compressed and crisp, really fleshing out the melodicism of their songwriting. On the songwriting aspect, him would expand their songwriting approach to a whole new level, thus really showcasing a wide variety of musical influences. Such examples, which there are so many to name, for starters would be Right Here in My Arms, which is such an infectious song that I know it is so repetitive, but I swear to God, it is an earworm of a track that is so infectious, I can't emphasize it enough. But the opening guitar melody sounds like something out of The Cure, yet the chorus and overall rhythm of this song sounds like something that Billy Idol would have done, with especially kind of mirrors the energy of like White Wedding, as it has that very like bold, brash, and again infectious melody you would get from something out of Billy Idol. Him kind of mirrors those influences on this particular track. Or the song Resurrection, again another track that I absolutely adore on this album, like every other song here, that Billy Vallow once described that it's Bon Jovi putting on goth mask, which definitely captures that anthemic energy you would get from a Bon Jovi single, but with that moody and gothic atmosphere that him just nailed so perfectly during this era. Other noteworthy influences that him cites on this album would be Kiss, Led Zeppelin, Depeche Mode, and Roxette. As for my personal overall enjoyment, I love every single second of this album so much. Every single track I can listen to from start to finish without even wanting to skip a moment of it. Everything is so anthemic. Everything is just so harmonizing and just ear candy for me, that when I discovered this back, like, God, I think when I was in maybe middle school, I would listen to it so much that I think I stated this once in a previous video. For a whole summer vacation, I just listened to this album every day as if it was my job, basically. I absolutely adore this album. It's one of my all-time favorite albums, just overall in music, just for the anthemic quality that it has. And for me personally, as obvious as this is, it's my personal favorite Him full-length album. Other standout tracks on this album, which basically it's everything, but I would also cite songs like Razorblade Kiss, Join Me in Death, Poison Girl, Heaven Tonight, and my personal favorite song on the album would be Death Is in Love With Us, which feels so anthemic like everything else in this album, but it's just so much more explosive and energetic for, Him standards anyway. From the guitar riffs to how Billy Vallow sings with his pitch and tone, that it's just ear candy and so impossible to just ignore that signature sound that he has. It's just perfection to me. Now, I might be getting a bit ahead of myself here in this video, but I feel like I need to state this early on already, is that when it comes to Him fans, it never seems to be people that only enjoy a particular era, they only like one or two albums or only a few songs. It always seems to be they enjoy everything that Him ever released, and I feel like it really has to do with the fact of just how consistent their songwriting was from start to finish. And if you want to get into Him, I feel like this is the album to start out with. This is a perfect representation of all the different, sounds, influences, genres, and vibe that Him provides throughout their whole discography. And for a lot of people, including myself, as I made this really obvious when I started talking about this album, this is their magnum opus. Other significant features about this album is that I truly feel like this is the album that started Him's journey into superstardom. While they didn't necessarily hit like international mainstream success just yet, what ended up happening on this album is their single Join Me in Death would be hitting the Billboard charts for both Finland and Germany at #1, along with the fact too that single would be featured in the soundtrack for the 1999 science fiction film The 13th Floor. This release would also be the first full-length album to truly feature at the front and center of the album artwork the signature symbol of Him, that being the heartagram. While the design for the heartagram was created by Billy Vallow on his 20th birthday, a few years prior to Razorblade Romance release, what makes this so significant is that it gave Him this sense of an identity visually. While it's just a mixture of a heart and a pentagram being put together, and from what I understand it symbolizes this juxtaposition between love and death, kind of like this mixture of something positive and negative, regardless of how you interpret it, it gave Him a visual identity. And symbolism in any form of art, big or small, is extremely significant, and it really helped Him's overall branding in terms of like this wide appeal in the international sense as they would progress onwards with their careers. I mean, I remember discovering Him and seeing this logo, or symbol I should say, and being just so enthralled by what it was, wondering where it came from, what's the band sound like, what does this mean? And again, I know it's just a heart and a pentagram, which is nothing really significant to maybe extreme metal fans, but think of any of your favorite artists or bands out there that use symbolism or a logo to help brand themselves. It really does create an identity that you don't really forget about. And Him used it with the heartagram, and it really paid off because so many people would use this in terms of tattoos on their body, to just really any kind of like fan art. It was just such a recognizable thing. Another odd but somewhat funny detail about this album that really confused me at first when I was getting into Him is that with the original release of Razorblade Romance, where they started selling copies in North America, is that they changed their name from Him to Her for the North American releases, and that all has to do with the fact that there already was an American band here that played in the style more of like jazz fusion and post-punk named Him, only I believe the I and M was in lowercase, that way there wouldn't be any confusion. And from what I searched up, there was kind of like this settlement or agreement between the two, that way they could keep both names. Hence why I think it's a huge reason as to Him's logo or font, the Finnish one anyway, the one I'm talking about here, is that it's always in uppercase, each letter, that being H, I, and M. But the most significant event that happened with this album, and it's a humongous reason as to why I even know of Him's existence to begin with, is this is the album that Bam Margera discovered them. So as the story goes, Bam Margera had a skate competition in Finland during May of the year 2000, and on his flight he noticed that there was a lot of articles for the rock band Him. And when he was staying at his hotel flipping through channels on the TV set, he came across the music video for Right Here in My Arms, and he immediately fell in love with the band and bought up all of their albums. This would be very significant for the success of Him, as Bam Margera during the early 2000s was quite a big name and a celebrity, considering the fact that he was a part of the Jackass crew, he was in all the Jackass movies, he had his own TV show Viva La Bam, and another spin-off show I believe titled Bam's Unholy Union, which funny enough I remember watching that when it aired late nights on MTV. Having someone of a celebrity status, at least in terms of like the alternative and skate scene, for any band is quite significant when it comes to attention, record sales, and just overall audience growth. I need to take a moment and sidetrack here from talking about Him's music and focus on the relationship between Bam Margera and the band Him. That regardless of what you think of Bam Margera, whether you find him to be annoying, obnoxious, or like this burnout individual that really didn't have any responsibilities and he's kind of paying the price for it now with all of his rehab that he's doing and such, it's without a shadow of a doubt, and this is coming from me, someone who's a diehard Him fan, Bam Margera is a humongous reason that people even know of Him to begin with. Again, I discovered Him when I was in middle school, and for all of us, regardless of who you are, when you were a teenager, you were really heavily influenced by pop culture, what was big, what was happening in the alternative scene, if you were into like, I guess, darker and edgier music, or just what was being put out in the mainstream. It's inescapable for a teenager, and to say that you're a teenager and you only focus on these esoteric, true kind of music scenes is a load of crap, because you still needed like someone to influence you to get into these more like esoteric or obscure things. So I always feel like it's a chain reaction for teenagers anyway, discovering something even in music. And with Bam Margera's relationship with Him, it's a huge chain reaction as to how I discovered it. I can guarantee a lot of people around my age group have like the same kind of like story when discovering Him. And yeah, it's a huge reason as to how they found success. Now, I know a lot of people look at Him as it's just like a scene band, it's just a mall band, they were a Hot Topic band, they only got big because of Bam Margera, therefore they suck, is what I've noticed. And I get that at face value, it does look like another like popular kind of band that was like a flavor of the month that teenage girls, ate up because it's got a pretty guy as a vocalist. And I really do feel like you're selling Him short there. Again, listen to Razorblade Romance to truly understand the musical appeal of Him. But what I'm trying to get here is, yes, I know of Him because of Bam Margera. Him's international success contributes a lot to what Bam Margera did for them. Bam Margera is a humongous reason as to how Him even played their first show in the United States, I believe during September of 2001, and it's a huge reason as how they were able to produce more music, as I believe he ended up producing music videos for him when it came to their album Dark Light, which obviously I'll be talking about later on in this video. Overall, what I'm trying to state here is that, well, yes, Bam Margera influenced a lot of people to listen to him as he played their music in all of his shows, and he would have the heartagram tattooed on him. And I believe even in his mansion or house, he had like this big heartagram hanging from one of his walls or whatever. Yes, but please don't let that kind of deviate away from just the really well-constructed songwriting that him has as a band. With all that said, let's get back on track. Another year later, in 2001, him would release their third full-length album, Deep Shadows with Brilliant Highlights. In this album, him would go for a much more soft approach here, where there really isn't any hard rock or metal portions within the album, relying a bit more, I've noticed, on acoustic instrumentations, and the keyboards are utilized more in the sense of like this, dare I say, synth pop effect that kind of reminds me a little bit more of Depeche Mode, which I know they've referenced before as an influence, but it really shines through on this particular album. That I know this is kind of a bold statement, because you could state that every him album is categorized as such, but I would consider this to be him's most melancholic album. I mean, songs on here like Salt in Our Wounds, Heartache Every Moment, Enjoy and Sorrow, Please Don't Let It Go, Pretending, Don't Close Your Heart. I mean, it's like, I've always been aware that their themes have to do with love and heartbreak, but they're really on the nose here, just from the song titles alone, with the heartbreak aesthetic that they're trying to portray. Still, me being the biased fanboy that I am, I absolutely love this album. I still think, even though it's going for a softer approach, which that is definitely objective here when discussing this album, the songwriting is still anthemic as all hell is like anything else in their catalog. It still has the moody and gothic type of vibe that they're going for, again, from any other album. I personally feel like it fits perfectly in their discography. It's the softer and more melancholic of the bunch that fits just like a puzzle piece. What I wasn't expecting when doing research on this album for this video is the reviews for it are extremely mixed. On one hand, you had people praising it for the exact reasons I just stated, which is why I enjoy it, while others tend to talk down upon it because, as I stated as well, it's a softer album. Going from influences like Black Sabbath to now more influences similar to that of Neil Young, where it's softer and doesn't have like that angst and metal sound to them, felt like it was a step back for the band. Even him themselves believe that this is kind of a missed opportunity album in their catalog, mainly because they felt as if it was so rushed, being written only within the time span of 11 months, and with all the critical and sales success that Razorblade Romance had, they felt as if they needed to capitalize on this, the record company and industry anyway. So there was a lot more people kind of giving their own 2 cents into how this album should be created in terms of production and overall, the industry's say on the matter. That Billy Vallow kind of paints a picture that when it came to writing the album Deep Shadows and Brilliant Highlights, it wasn't so much him, a band, writing this album, but more so him as a company pumping out another release. Regardless, in terms of record sales, it charted #1 both in Austria and Finland, and it's the first ever album of theirs to chart on the Billboard 200, I believe peaking at the 190th spot. However, the most positive thing that came from this album is that this would be their first release where they would have a bulletproof lineup that would be consistent from here on outwards. I forgot to mention on the previous album, Razorblade Romance, they would include their longtime drummer Mika Gas Lipstick into their lineup. And on this album, Deep Shadows and Brilliant Highlights, is where they would have the consistent keyboardist, that being Jan Burden, who would be a part of him from here on outwards. 2 years later, in 2003, Him would release their fourth full-length album, Love Metal. What's interesting about this album at face value is the album title, Love Metal. What makes this quite significant is from the beginning of this video, from everything I've talked about, to even when Him released this album, no one really knew, at least with their fans, what to call Him as a genre tag. Some people would say gothic rock or gothic metal, or they're just a rock band. And Him really never wanted to be characterized or kind of, shoved in a corner with genre tags. And Love Metal is kind of like their way of telling people what to categorize their sound. Again, it is a mixture of hard rock, goth rock, and forms of gothic metal and heavy metal all blended together. But instead of saying like a word salad of genre tags, they just simply wanted to be labeled as Love Metal. And Love Metal is definitely what you're going to be hearing a lot on this album, as I would characterize this as Him's most straightforward approach to a traditional heavy metal sounding album. Songs on here like the opening track, Buried Alive by Love, Circle of Fear, The Sacrament, Sweet Pandemonium, and especially the song Soul on Fire, you can definitely tell that they were heavily influenced by bands such as Black Sabbath to even Led Zeppelin to a certain degree. This album would contain 3 singles, all of which would have music videos: Funeral of Hearts, Buried Alive by Love, and The Sacrament. However, 2 of them were directed by band Margera, that being Buried Alive by Love and The Sacrament, which only helped appeal more to an international audience in North America. So much so that Him was able to tour in the United States for the very first time, thus selling out every single venue they played at. Another interesting aspect about this album isn't so much the music, but the presentation and album artwork. Every album prior to this had Billy Vallow front and center on the album artwork, yet with Love Metal, smack dab in the middle is just the heartogram, giving this sense to me now that Him has really found their unique identity, that there's so much more than just selling off like Billy Vallow as like this pretty boy that teenage girls will just like buy up because of their image. And Love Metal to me really feels like the first true representation of Him being like this one cohesive unit of a band, all contributing their own really unique performances and styles all together as a band, and really creating Love Metal as its own unique entity within music. Fast forward another 2 years to 2005, and Him would release their 5th full-length album, Dark Light. Musically speaking, this album still retains most of the gothic rock and somewhat metal aspect about Him that fans would come to know and love, but it's a lot more polished in the sense of more accessibility, as it kind of gives off more of a flair of like this alternative rock type of execution on some of these songs. Regardless, this album would end up being the most commercially successful Him album to date, selling over 500,000 copies alone in the United States, along with once again charting to #1 in their home country of Finland. This album really propelled Him into the mainstream. On the promotional side of things, yes, of course, band Margera was a huge factor in terms of promoting Him's music during this time as well, but even Kat Von D, a celebrity tattoo artist, found a lot of enjoyment with this album, so much so that she was featured in the music video for Killing Loneliness, and even did tattoo work for all the members of Him, and I believe she even has a heartogram tattooed on herself as well. But with all the glitz and glam, mainstream appeal, record sales, and celebrity promotion attached with this album, don't let that motivate you to steer clear of it, because the songwriting is just as gloomy, dark, moody, and top-notch as anything else in their catalog. For me personally, this album has the best openers out of any Him album. That it has the strongest 4 tracks that they could possibly start with, that being Vampire Heart, Wings of a Butterfly, Under the Rose, and Killing Loneliness being the first 4 songs on the album. You'll fall in love with it just from that alone. Because while yes, it has more of like this alternative rock pop type of effect to it that adds more accessibility to this album compared to their previous releases that isn't like so metal focused, what it allows with that accessibility is for him to just reach whole new heights. Because seriously, those 4 tracks are so monumental sounding that it makes it even more anthemic and just more infectious, I feel like. But it doesn't sacrifice the gloomy, melancholic vibe of their love metal style that they're known for. Honestly, the opening track, Vampire Heart, it's just such an earworm of a chorus, and that sound and vibe, its momentum just gets carried over from track to track. Other great standout tracks on here would be the title track, Dark Light, and Behind the Crimson Door, which again showcases more of their usage of keyboards and synthesizer that I just can't help but always compare to that of something like Depeche Mode's The Black Celebration, which, if I can ever be reminded of Depeche Mode in any sense, that's a huge plus for me. Overall, it's a fantastic album, and I cannot emphasize this enough. Do not sleep on it solely because they went more commercialized with it. It's still just as great as anything else in their catalog. Fast forward another 2 years to 2007, and Him would release their 6th full-length album, Venus Doom. This goes without saying because everyone seems to unanimously agree on this, that this is Him's heaviest album they ever did. Reason for that is this borderlines now not so much on just like gothic metal, but to some points doom metal, taking influences from such bands like My Dying Bride and Paradise Lost. Those influences become all the more obvious when you listen to songs like the title track Venus Doom, Dead Lover's Lane, Passion's Killing Floor, The Kiss of Dawn, which opens up with literally a doom metal riff, and the other track on here that's more of a deep cut, Cyanide Sun, that is just straight up doom metal guitar riffs from beginning to end on that track. Add to the fact Billy Vallow's vocal performance on here is a lot deeper, even using some vocal effects to make it sound all the more, I would even say, demonic sounding. Songs on here like Bleed Well and The Kiss of Dawn, you'll notice some of those effects, which again really enhances that doom metal type of execution they're going for. A huge factor as to why this album is a lot darker and heavier sonically has to do with Billy Vallow's own personal life, going through breakups prior to this album's release, and a main contributor to it has to do with Phil Vallow's alcohol abuse during this time, with all of the kind of hectic lifestyle he was going through of touring all over the world, releasing music on a consistent basis, always having to do interviews non-stop, which if you search up Billy Vallow interviews, there are so many online. Hell, even fucking Watch Mojo did an interview with Billy Vallow, which I'm surprised they didn't end up doing like a top 10 Billy Vallow syllables that he said in that interview. But regardless, he just had a very, very hectic life, and to cope with it, he'd use alcohol. Prior to this album's release, it really caught up with him, and you can tell that kind of, heavy, kind of dark angst that this album has, it kind of all manifested from Billy Vallow's personal life with alcohol abuse, and that's why this album just feels heavier and more, aggressive, again, for him standards anyway. And while he would sober up shortly after this album's release, what we ended up getting is arguably one of Him's best releases in their catalog. Because again, if you're a doom metal fan watching this and you never heard of this album, this is the album to check out. If you want him at their heaviest, as I stated, Venus Doom is the album to listen to. In terms of record sales, once again, him would find a lot of success. This album actually being the highest they would ever chart on the Billboard 200, peaking at number 12 and charting at number 1 in the Billboard Hard Rock category. 3 years later in 2010, him would release their 7th full-length album, Screamworks, Love and Theory in Practice. In this album, it would be somewhat of a breath of fresh air for him for a multitude of reasons. The big key factor being, for the first time out of his whole discography, Billy Vallow performed and wrote an album completely sober. Prior to this album's release, Billy Vallow went to rehab for alcoholism, and you can clearly tell from the output of this album, finding this new sense of motivation in life and completely disregarding alcohol in his, main life. You can tell that this album is a lot more uplifting and has, as he describes it, a lighter shade of black, so to say, taking inspiration from bands such as Aha, Depeche Mode, and The Cult. The end result when it comes to the musical performance on this album is everything feels lighter and happier. Take for example Billy Vallow's vocal performance. It's nowhere as deep and just feels as if he's singing at somewhat of a slightly higher register that just makes this album feel a bit more lush and vibrant to the ears. And the biggest change instrumentally that at least I notice is the keyboards on here feel so much more front and center, whereas previous albums they were always noticeable but in the sense of like a backdrop to give off more of this gothic, moody kind of like atmosphere and melody for an extra special effect. Yet with this album, you'll notice that every single song almost on here starts off with a keyboard melody that again is very reminiscent to something you would hear from Aha and Depeche Mode. Standout songs on this album would be Heart Killer, Scared to Death, Catherine Wheel, and Shatter Me with Hope. That again, it's a lot more lush and welcoming sounding that almost borderlines on some parts, even though it's still gothic rock or love metal in their case, borderlines on elements of new wave. I've always found this release to be particularly quite underrated in the Him discography, mainly because when we look at the first 6 full-length albums, that's like the pinnacle of Him's output, as it's way more heavily rooted with forms of it being darker and heavier with like a strong foundation on heavy metal with most of those albums, whereas with Screamworks, it's more in a pop sense, again, giving off more like that new wave type of execution, that I've always looked at this album as being another different shade of darkness in the Hymns repertoire for how they create music. So definitely do not sleep on this album as well. I think in terms of its vibe and aesthetic, it fits the discography perfectly. But again, if you're looking for a lighter, lusher, and more pop-fueled type of output in Hymns discography, this will definitely appeal to you. Then in 2013, Him would release their 8th and final full-length album, Tears on Tape. At this point in Him's careers, you're starting to realize now that the band has a lot of wear and tear and fatigue, I feel like, when it comes to writing and performing music. One example being that their longtime drummer Mikko Karppinen suffered nerve damage in his wrist, which made it quite difficult for him to do any form of drumming because of all of the stressful environment surrounding him. This album would also feel as if Him didn't really introduce anything new. It doesn't really have that many standout features about it musically, as it just feels like a continuation of like everything they've done before. So it does kind of feel like an amalgamation of everything, but it's not really progressing or taking on a different direction for the band. The only noticeable characteristics that people tend to point out about it is that this would be the only album in Him's catalog where it would have straight up instrumental tracks on an album. While this album does have its moments, For me personally, it never really clicked with me enough to really start listening to it over and over again. Where every other album in their catalog prior to this has distinct moments or something that I feel like gives it an identity, where Tears on Tape, it just feels like, we're doing everything you kind of expect from us. So, I don't know, I don't have really much to say about this album, and I really do feel like this is him kind of realizing after this album's release that, there's not much more they can offer to their audience, and they're realizing now that the gas tank in terms of their creative ideas is really running thin. This would be the case for him, because in the following years from 2013 to 2017, him would remain silent, not releasing any new material, which is quite the longest that they would go without releasing a full length. The reason being is that Billy Vallow states in interviews that they were always planning on doing new material, but they felt as if the spark wasn't there. They were still always getting along with each other, and they clearly had unity with the band itself. It's just, they felt as if they've done everything that they can do within the style of music for him, and felt as if after 25 years of creating love metal, that it's time to put this band to rest, and in 2017, they announced a farewell tour. I gotta admit, that's a really respectable decision on him's behalf to end this band on a high note, because, they could have stayed together, releasing subpar albums, and more than likely still charting on the record sales, and with their die-hard fan base that they have, easily would have been selling out venues and, making still a high profit from just their name alone. But again, to end it on a high note and realize now that, the creative ideas that they have are running thin, I do feel like that's incredibly respectable, considering the fact that they were active for 25 years at this point, and they've done what they set out to do, and they accomplished what they wanted, and then some, I feel like. And while it's incredibly bittersweet that the band, is no longer active, at least we can all look at it and be happy over the fact that it did happen to begin with, and their music is out there to enjoy. Since the breakup of him, all members would go on to do their own side projects, but most noticeably, Billy Vallow would stay active, releasing music, doing collaborations with some Finnish artists around the scene, but most noticeably with this, he released his own solo full-length album, Neon Noir, under the moniker now of VV, which is just basically Billy Vallow's initials, and this feels somewhat of a continuation and a prologue to that of him, as it has Billy Vallow singing, obviously, so the similarities are there. Keep in mind though, this isn't the other members of him contributing to musical ideas, and it's just Billy Vallow's interpretation and input. Therefore, you still get some of these gothic, moody moments, but the metal aspect is completely stripped away in favor of a more kind of like rock, pop, gothic kind of input. Still phenomenal stuff that I feel like any and all him fans would enjoy. But since then, there's always been talk about him reforming and doing a reunion tour. Whether that ever happens, who knows? It's up in the air at this point. Personally, I feel like from what I've read and what I keep up with, all of them seem to be quite content with just doing their own personal projects, and looking at him as somewhat of a chapter in their life that they can look back fondly, but realize that life is an open book, that there's a lot more different events to happen. So while the possibility is there, I'm not really holding my breath on a him reunion though. But again, all of them seem to be quite focused on their own personal endeavors, which is totally respectable. For me personally, I've been a fan of him for the past 16 years of my life, and I've always found their songwriting to be so incredibly infectious that every single album of theirs has something that just gets drilled in my head that I end up listening to their discography over and over again without even breaking a sweat. And while I know a lot of people undersell them and look down on them even too, that they were just a product of their time. Bam Margera's a humongous reason why they got big. The only people who enjoyed him were like teenage girls back in the mid 2000s, and that they were just, you know, crappy mall metal music or whatever have you. And I get that again when it comes to the, you know, presentation of what you can see at face value with him. Yeah, they had a lot of marketing that worked in their favor, and that's what led to their success. I get that, but seriously, I've noticed now so many people that I've talked to that have rediscovering him or actually giving them a chance are realizing now that their songwriting and music is incredibly good. That, you know, don't judge a book by its cover, I feel like. The songwriting is, as I stated, super infectious. What makes them really special and so consistent is how they're able to blend so many different influences. It's not just a prettier kind of like submissive version of Typo Negative, which I noticed some people kind of state in a joking way with him. There's so many other influences that they have that makes each album have its own identity and uniqueness to it, while still being consistent with that love metal sound that they've been creating for over a quarter of a century, I feel like. I can't talk highly enough of this band, and I guess really the only selling point I can give to people who dislike them or dismiss them because of their overall appearance and what they kind of had with the media going with them is give them a fair shot. Again, listen to Razorblade Romance, the fan favorite, and you'll understand as to why so many people are so easily indulged by their music songwriting, and these songs will get drilled into your head for, I feel like personally, at least for me, for years to come, and they always have been and always will be one of my all-time favorite bands in music. And that'll do it for this video, guys. So happy to finally do a video all about him. Really curious to know what you think of this band and whatever thoughts you have all about this. And that is that. So like always, links provided to everything I talked about will be in the description below. Make sure, like always, guys, you guys drink plenty of water to stay hydrated, and have a great day.